On December 12, 2015, in Paris, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC for short, came to an agreement to combat climate change and lower the carbon emissions. And for those of you asking what the Paris Agreement is, it is basically an agreement that was signed by many countries in order to help combat climate change and lower carbon emissions. But in 2017, President Donald Trump announced that the US was dropping out of the Paris Agreement, considering that Trump had previously stated that climate change was a hoax. The US dropping out of the Paris Agreement was an awful decision considering that the US is the second largest carbon emitter right after China. But if the US had chosen to stay in the Paris Agreement, they could have potentially helped reduce the amount of carbon emitted. The Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015 when the UNFCCC had a climate conference in Paris. But it wasn't until the following year when, out of 187 countries, only 125 countries had signed. Since 2016, the number had changed, and many more countries have since then agreed and signed to the Paris Agreement. As I mentioned before, the Paris Agreement is an agreement signed by many countries in order to help combat climate change and have lower carbon emissions, trying to keep the temperature rising from 2 degrees higher. What these 2 degrees mean is that the normal temperature that we have now would rise 2 degrees, making the Earth hotter and cause catastrophe. So the Paris Agreement is in place so that countries can limit the emissions that they produce, helping the Earth stay nice and cool. The agreement states that all countries should come together every 5 years to report the progress that they have done over the years. The countries have also agreed to adapt to the changes that the climate change would bring, as well as the fact that the countries would need to cooperate and understand the action that is happening with climate change. But this agreement is not a solution to stop all climate change. It is just a step for a better future. On June 2017, Trump had announced that the US was getting out of the Paris Agreement. Trump had previously stated that he thinks that climate change is a hoax. Even though there is many scientific studies backing up that climate change is in fact real, Trump just refuses to believe it. Besides that, the US getting out of the Paris Agreement is a big mistake. According to Business Insider, Trump got out of the Paris Agreement because it is an unfair economic burden on American workers, businesses, and taxpayers, which is false. The US is the second highest carbon emitter, and at number 1 is China. According to Our World Data, a website that tracks the world's carbon emissions, globally we produce about 36 million tons of CO2 per year. China produces about 9.8 billion tons while the US emits about 5.3 billion tons of CO2. What this means essentially is that the US, for example, would burn fossil fuel for energy. Carbon dioxide would be released into the air, and that would start to build up in the atmosphere. And when it was starting to a point where the sun would hit the earth and the hot rays of the sun would get trapped inside the earth rather than bounce off, which then causes the earth to get hot, also known as the greenhouse effect. When the earth heats up, the ice begins to melt, which means that the ocean levels would rise and could potentially start to flood many places, causing them to disappear. For example, Miami could potentially get flooded, and that would mean no more traveling to Miami for spring break. Sorry. Besides the floods, the oceans would get hotter, causing many of the organisms and animals to die. So potentially your favorite seafood dish could vanish forever. Trump might continuously say that the Paris Agreement will hurt the US economy. He stated this in his 2017 Rose Garden address that it would cost the US about $3 trillion by 2040 and 2.7 million jobs by 2025. Since then, many have debunked this and found that the cost of climate inaction far outweighs the cost of reducing carbon pollution. Some studies actually suggest that the US being out of the Paris Agreement can cost the economy as much as $6 trillion in the upcoming decades. So, the US being out of the Paris Agreement can make the US lose more money than they had originally thought. Although Trump has announced that the US is out of the Paris Agreement, it is not that simple to get out of the agreement. It takes up to 3 years to get out of the agreement, so the official date that the US would get out of the Paris Agreement would be on November 4th, 2020, a day after the elections, which means the new president could potentially get back into the Paris Agreement once again. In conclusion, the Paris Agreement was made to help the countries around the world reduce the amount of carbon they emit and help combat climate change. With the US being out of the Paris Agreement, it could potentially hurt our Earth, more considering the fact that we are the second highest carbon emitter. But this can be changed if the new president decides to get back into the agreement. And like I said before, this agreement is not a solution, but it's a better step towards a brighter future. Thank you.